Is there such thing as a best way to practice? To get more out of any study session, out of any athletic performance? Is there a way to cause yourself to learn more faster? That's the question I set out to answer. Science has a lot of different findings on this topic, and if you're really interested in it, I highly suggest that you check out the blog post that accompanies this YouTube video at lifebyexperimentation.com. The link is in the show notes. So, before we get started, there's 6 main topics that we're going to cover. I'm going to break them down one by one for you. The topics are choosing good tasks, variation or switching up the tasks, using short sessions, having goals, practicing frequently, and resting. And in the end, I'll talk about my perfect practice schedule. One of the most important topics that comes up in all of learning is this idea of deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is the process of thinking about thinking, or metacognition. Essentially, it means that you are self-aware in your practice. You understand and you reflect upon what you are doing. In order to use deliberate practice, you need to be at the perfect level of difficulty. So this is what I mean by choosing good tasks. In order to deliberately practice, you need to be at a point that's just hard enough, but not too hard. You need to be challenged, but not frustrated or bored, in this kind of valley of optimal experience. This is something frequently referred to as flow, being in that perfect valley of optimal experience. And when you're there, you're able to notice what is going well and what is going poorly. So, to contrast deliberate practice with what you might call lazy practice is just doing the moves. If you're practicing the guitar, you are just not thinking about just kind of hitting the strings with the pick. It's what my hockey coach used to call just going through the motions. It's not thinking about how you go about them. So this idea of metacognition goes hand in hand with deliberate practice through the process of learning. It's something which is somewhat difficult to explain, but when you do it, you start to see and feel it in a way that really stands out. When you're deliberately practicing, you are fully engaged in the practice session. You are noticing when things go right and when things go wrong, and you correct them very intentionally. It's this sort of thought process that brings intention to the process of learning, to the process of practicing. So, an autodidact is the word given to somebody who teaches themselves. And when you are teaching yourself, one of the great advantages is that you're able to calibrate, constantly readjust what is good and what is bad about your practice session. When you're in a big classroom full of people, it's very difficult to just skip ahead or slow down a little bit. But when you are teaching yourself, when you are an autodidact, you can essentially tweak the difficulty through this process of deliberate practice so that things are always just as hard as they need to be. You can always go back and review, and you can always move forward if something's too easy. This is why I like to use any and all methods of quantification that I can when I'm attempting to learn. Anything that can give you a numerical sense of where you're at and how hard it is allows you to fine-tune that difficulty level. So there's, again, a post about this on the blog that explains in more detail the research that goes into deliberate practice, and specifically how deliberate practice and flow work together, as well as what research video games have contributed in order to help this process as well. Because video games actually contribute a lot of a sense of fun to learning, and they can really aid in this process of deliberate practice. Next up, let's talk about variation, or switching up your learning. One of the worst things you can do for long-term retention is to study for the test, to memorize information or to cram just to regurgitate that information a few hours later. It's a very ineffective way to remember things long-term. There's been plenty of studies that have been done that have shown that repetition over time is much, much more effective than any one little cram session. A technique that can actually be very helpful, that's essentially the opposite of cramming, is pre-testing. It's interesting because when you pre-test, you're essentially at the very beginning, before you start studying, before you start learning, before you start practicing, testing your ability. And this might sound frustrating, and it is, but that's the point. When you pre-test, you're giving yourself a sort of map of the territory, a look, an overview of what you're about to start learning. If that biology test, if you take it before you ever start studying, you're going to then later, when you study, start to hone in on those things, those items that you need to learn more about. So the process of pre-testing has actually been shown to improve retention and to improve learning. But moreover, the notion of variation when you are studying is extraordinarily important, essentially because the brain will take shortcuts. This is why cramming is no good, because you memorize facts, you memorize one little bit of information without understanding the underlying truth. It's the difference between memorizing the quadratic formula in math and being able to derive it on the test. It's not necessarily that memorizing it is bad, it's more that when you are able to derive a mathematical formula, you have a more holistic, rich understanding of where it came from and how it should be applied. So you'll start to see the material in a more comprehensive way, as opposed to when you memorize it, you might not necessarily know how, when, or where to best use it. The brain essentially is going to create these shortcuts. It will always be lazy. It will always learn the simplest possible version of whatever you give it. So when you use variation, when you change things up, you force the brain to learn the underlying truth, the thing that connects the different pieces of study, as opposed to each individual fact. So essentially, variation allows the brain to gain a holistic understanding of the knowledge as opposed to a context-specific understanding of the knowledge, which then yields greater transfer. For more about transfer, check out the Learning Glossary at lifebyexperimentation.com. Next up, using short sessions. So there's something called the primary recency effect, or sometimes the serial position effect. What this says is essentially that the beginning and the end of any given study period are going to be more effective than the middle period. And as you make the study period longer, the ineffective time, or the less effective time, will become more and more of the overall study time. So it's actually much, much more effective to keep the study sessions short and practice sessions short. This applies to physical skills, this applies to studying, mental skills. Essentially, as you get fatigued, you are wasting more of the time that you spend studying. So almost paradoxically, it's better to keep to, say, a 20 or 30-minute study session is what's frequently recommended, and then take short breaks. And when you come back, then you will be rested and refreshed, and you will have given yourself some time for the knowledge to consolidate. I'm going to talk more about that in the topic on rest later on. Next, I'll talk about goals. Goals are little milestones along the way to learning. And if you don't have a goal, then you have no good way to quantify or to track your progress. And if you have no way to do that, then you can't see where you're going. And that's kind of like driving blind in the middle of the night. You're just going to end up somewhere. Maybe you crashed into a tree, but probably not where you wanted to go. So goals are what allow you to just understand where you are at in the process. So each time you achieve a goal, you're going to get this little rush of a chemical called dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter. It's a brain chemical that is associated with feeling good. You may have heard about it before because it shows up in video games, in gambling, all different places. Well, goals are a way to naturally release little hits of dopamine. So, in fact, goals are again what connect learning with fun, with Even video games use this same principle of these little goals that you achieve, and each time you get one, you feel good. My background in video game design, we use this all the time. We started with very simple, easy goals, and we started to add in harder and harder and harder goals. In addition to having little goals that you can quantify for each study session, it can be good to have a long, overarching goal as well. Something that keeps your eye on the prize, so to speak. Something that is going to be something that you want in life. Maybe it's passing a test. For me, right now, I'm learning the guitar, and one of my big goals is to be able to perform in front of friends. It's a scary goal, but it kind of keeps me focused on why I'm here, what I'm doing it for. So those two aspects of goals are good ways to motivate yourself, but there's one more important thing about goals. When you have an unresolved goal, it's like having an unclosed loop. It means that you have this kind of nagging sensation. Again, there's been research done on this, that an unfinished goal is kind of psychologically troublesome in a way that causes you to want to come back to it. So if you can leave a study session at the point where you haven't quite finished the goal, then you might find that you are really inclined to want to come back and do another session later on. Okay, practicing frequently. Now, of course, you need to practice on a regular schedule in order to really see the most out of your practice. But this is a very delicate balance. When I talked earlier about keeping your study sessions or your practice sessions short, that only works when you practice frequently. If you just study for 20 minutes once a week, then you're not going to make a whole lot of progress. The key to frequent practice is essentially figuring out your own particular recovery curve, or understanding how you work best. If the key here is to come back to each study or practice session feeling good, feeling like you are ready to start it. But at the same time, you don't want to be so recovered that you've given yourself a whole bunch of time and you've essentially lost the benefits of the last study session. So in order to really understand how frequent practice works, I'm going to skip to the next section, which talks about resting. Resting is a vitally important part of learning and practicing and studying anything, or even working out, anything that involves self-improvement. Rest is a critical component. Sleep is frequently overlooked these days. It's kind of seen as a weakness in today's culture. But the truth is, we need it. We need it to get better. And this is because sleep is a restorative process. There are many different theories about exactly how sleep works. Science doesn't understand it perfectly, but what we do know is that it appears to be heavily linked with two very important things. The first is memory consolidation, so taking the things that you learned through the day and essentially rearranging them or repackaging them so that you can remember them later. And the second is physical restoration, so rebuilding muscles and other parts of your body. All of this is a restorative process that is vital for learning, because this is where learning actually happens. It's a misconception that we learn during the actual practice session. The truth is, the learning, the growth happens during the recovery. That's the time when the body is building itself back up. There are other types of recovery too, beyond just sleeping. There's also things like visualization, which can help you to kind of practice without actually being in an explicit practice session. There's been tons of research recently on this idea of using visualization to improve. It's something that athletes have been doing for years and years, visualizing their performance before they get out in the field. But now we're starting to find that there's actually good reason why this works. The brain actually does nearly identical things when you visualize. In fact, there's been some studies that have even shown muscle growth from the task of visualization as opposed to actually doing something, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. There's also other aspects to rest and recovery, like stress reduction. Stress reduction is important because stress gets in the way of learning. When you are feeling relaxed and at ease, you are allowing yourself to learn. This is critical in human evolution. Stress is what happens evolutionarily when we need to shut everything else down, when we need to focus on the tiger that might be attacking us. So as long as you can get rid of that stress, you can open up the pathways to development and learning. There's also many other beneficial aspects and other ways to recover well. Again, I encourage you to visit the blog at lifebyexperimentation.com to see a bit more about good strategies for recovering from a practice session. Now finally, I'm going to talk about what for me is the perfect practice session. When I have a day where I can just practice as much as I want, I go about it this way. I do 20 to 30 minute sessions, interleaved with about 10 to 15 minute breaks. So I might get up and practice, then have a cup of coffee, then practice, then have breakfast, then practice, then write a blog post, then practice, and so on. Now, of course, I'm not a machine. I can't do this all day long with perfect timing. And I've actually found, though, that it's much more effective for me to do maybe 6-8 of those practice sessions, those 30-minute practice sessions, so 3 or 4 hours of total practice time in the day, than to do one huge long practice session. Now, that being said, there is something to be gained from really pushing yourself and testing your endurance. An endurance athlete, for example, running marathons, probably wants to run for many hours at a time, at least for part of their training. But don't underestimate the value of concentrated, focused practice for short periods of time. In fact, even in athletic training, there's been a growing movement in high-intensity interval training, even among long-distance athletes. And what this means is they essentially do a short burst of really high-intensity workouts, something that pushes them so hard that they're gasping for air at the end of just minutes of working out. And they do that instead of long marathon prep. Again, this is a bit of a tangent, and there's a lot of nuance in terms of how to exactly use, say, high-intensity interval training. But the point remains that short bursts for 20 or 30 minutes in practice and study time are extraordinarily effective, especially when you combine them with breaks, when you combine them with goals, deliberate practice. All of these things work together to create for a maximally effective practice or study session. So there you have it. That's how I construct my practice sessions. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what works for you and what doesn't work. Leave a comment in the YouTube video or over at the blog at lifebyexperimentation.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Inzania. That's INZANIA. Thanks, and I hope you enjoyed it.